CONTERCAST. My name's Kat Boyd. I'm joined with my lovely co-host, David Jameson.
How are you? Good to see you in person.
It is nice to see you in person.
Mm-hmm.
It is nice. I'm fine. Glad that we are more than halfway through COP26.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure where we're at on the kind of schedule here, right? So obviously,
it finishes the weekend.
When do we hear the deal or not deal?
You mean you don't know? Yeah,
Who does?
I don't know. The Glasgow Agreement.
Yes, the Glasgow Agreement that if it passes will be hailed as the greatest development in ecological history.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if we could stop using fossil fuels and simply power the world on
self-congratulation.
Well, I was thinking specifically selfies, particularly Nicola Sturgeon's selfies with world leaders. If that could be converted into an energy source, then I think we would be onto a winner.
Yeah, the national newspaper. Sorry, we're getting invaded by
my cat,
Walter Kitty. The national newspaper, their coverage of the entire event has simply been a sequence of photographs of Nicola Sturgeon with world leaders, each one implying that Scotland will surely soon become an independent country, take its place on the world stage, be an equal among these nations. But, you know, there's an obvious contradiction in this, which is they keep presenting pictures of like Nicola Sturgeon with world leaders as though they're kind of like very happy that the Bidens of the world would grace, you know, little Scotland with their gigantic persona.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that Nicola Sturgeon has necessarily done anything wrong in promoting Scotland as like a nation in waiting. Like, I think all that stuff from the Tories about, you know, Nicola Sturgeon,
they're just as silly on the other end.
Do you know what I mean? It's just like, it's a piece of nonsense. Like, of course, do you know what I mean? Any leader of a political party is going to be talking in the language and ideology of their political party.
Yeah.
Anyone who wasn't using this as some kind of political opportunity would be a bad politician.
Yeah, and you know, it is, apart from anything else, her job to build things like business links between Scotland and Germany and the United States, and she loves to do it.
Yeah, and she's good at it. Do you know what I mean? For that type of politics. Although, I mean, today that picture of her AOC and the can of Iron Brew has really just tipped me over the edge.
Yeah, but that's an interesting one, because AOC doesn't really have any power, right? So it's not like when she's meeting Biden or when she's meeting some bureaucrat from Brussels. AOC isn't bringing any kind of like office into that situation.
Just left cover,
right? It's this visage of the kind of transatlantic left. That's purely what Sturgeon wants from that meeting. She's not talking about trade with AOC. She's definitely not talking about, you know, socialist strategy of how to influence politics in the Western world from the left. She's not interested in that. The only thing she wants from AOC is that photograph.
Of course.
Which kind of makes you think that AOC should perhaps be a bit more careful about who she's giving that photograph to.
I mean, but I have my own critique of AOC, which I'm sure we can get into at some point on the show, maybe not today. But yeah, I think AOC has made a number of very questionable judgments, the selfie with Nicola Sturgeon being the least questionable.
That's true.
You know, the her switching position on the vote about further military aid to Israel was very questionable indeed.
Yeah.
And I also think some of her antics around the Capitol Hill protests, riots, insurgency, whatever it's being called now, I thought were like really, really shocking.
The thing with Sturgeon that I find interesting with her photograph is like it was a meeting of two nuclear warhead level parasocial relationship type politicians. Right? That's such a spectacle. These are two people who their basic performance, their basic sort of situation in politics is that they suggest things to people that never materially arrive.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of beautiful meeting of that type of symbolic politics. So intense that, do you know what I mean? It's the kind of thing that could just explode and create a wormhole or something. But it was, yeah. I mean, look, AOC is not in a position to know that Nicola Sturgeon spent the last week basically endorsing strike breaking in the city. You know what I mean? Where she's just touched down. With the best will in the world, AOC probably doesn't have an international schedule of which leaders.
Which leaders are okay to get a photo with, and
yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah,
of course. But I don't think that. I mean, that's not really my objection to it. I hate the selfie celebrity politician culture. I don't think it's helpful for left-wing politics at all.
Obviously not. I mean, my favorite selfie has been that one, Susan Aitken, the greatest leader of our city council in world history, met up with her Parisian counterpart, who people could then say, had helped to repress the yellow vest movement. And so both of them had been in conflict with recent conflict with angry people in yellow vests.
Yeah, angry predominantly men wearing high vis.
Yeah.
I mean, it's wonderful.
But
honestly, God bless the bin strike.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, obviously, like, I really hope that they are able to get a concession out of the city council, but also it was pretty much the only part of COP26 that felt like there was actually friction between those
with power and without.
Yeah. I mean, the demonstration on Saturday was obviously huge, and do you know what I mean? There was like huge trade union block, and a vibrancy to it that people seemed to really celebrate and really like. But there just feels like there's no friction, like there's no antagonism. Like the difference between the inside of COP26 and the outside is very, very fluid. Do you know what I mean? There feels like there's a kind of the barrier between the inside and the outside is perforated. I feel like there's a degree of people on the inside of the COP event saying, my heart is really with the protesters. And that's basically what Nancy Pelosi was saying when she spoke on the gender day or whatever it was. She was like,
there was a finance day and a gender day.
She was like, as we say in Congress, what happens inside the house is important, but what really makes the difference is what happens outside, like the big movements. And this is Nancy Pelosi. I mean, you couldn't get more of an establishment figure.
That's the thing you've got to say now. If you're like an establishment, I mean, what is Nancy Pelosi? A center-right politician?
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say. If you're on the center-right of politics, you need to say real change happens on the streets.
Yeah.
Like, that's the thing you need to say now.
And this is what I mean about the kind of the almost frictionlessness of COP26, of the actual conference, and the sort of the alternatives on the outside. Is that inside it's full of people saying things like, my heart is with the protesters. And the outside is full of, the NGO world saying, well, we've got to be pragmatic. We've got to like build these things together. Do you know what I mean? And that's not to say that there aren't any elements of like anger or militancy. There are, but it's a spectrum, and those elements are definitely at the edges.
Yeah, one thing that I said when I was thinking about it when I came over here, because in the West End it's covered in posters from various groups relating to COP26. But one thing I noticed was, because I've heard people say, well, this is like the G8, although look where it's come to at this point. The language is much more radical. It's much more about capitalism and all this kind of stuff. But I was looking at all these posters that say things like, act now because it's too late. It's one we've discussed. Blah, blah, blah was the kind of slogan that Greta Thunberg was putting about, and a bunch of others. But when I looked at these posters all came from NGOs. They weren't from protest groups as such, and they'd all been designed to look like they'd come from protest groups. So really what I think has happened is like one of the things that I've taken away from the protest culture around this particular movement is that it's quite highly professionalized. It's quite well ensconced into the kind of NGO scene. In fact, I wonder if the sorts of people who were leading protests in 2005 at the G8 in Scotland, I wonder if they are now in a position where they control some of the local branches of these NGOs, stuff like that, right? I mean, they're probably aged to the point where they can do that. But I have to say, like, the overwhelming feeling I got from being on both demonstrations was an enormous sense of deja vu, like overwhelming. Like there were points where I was having that proper like Proust's Madeleine thing. Do you know what I mean? Where I was, or that kind of, that actual deja vu feeling where you feel transported to a different time. It just felt a lot like the kind of protest movements that were around circa 2005, 2006. And I dare say before, at the turn of the century, with the kind of anti-globalization movement, whatever you want to call it. I
mean, see, the difference though with the anti-globalization movement is that, well, we're now at the point where like the argument about globalization has been lost on the left and won by the right, I would say. And the anti-globalization movement, like of the early 2000s, there was friction. There was actually, do you know what I mean? There was a high degree of militancy, and it might have been from, you know, maybe like smaller organized militant groups, but there were definitely like moments of, I mean, there was battles on the street.
Yeah.
Like famously, you know, Seattle, Genoa,
yeah,
these types of movements where there was actually like a significant friction between the like protectors of state power and officialdom and those who were resisting it. And all of that has gone in nearly every single movement. And where there have been those like fractious movements have emerged around climate change, it has emerged in a way that's quite messy and ugly. You know, that's not this kind of protest chic, and it's not homemade placards. Has emerged, well, I mean, the best example I can think of is the Gilets jaunes, like where there has been friction. I mean, that's probably the most militant end of a kind of environmental or green movement that's happened in Europe. I can't think of another one where there's actually been.
And of course, they were kind of they were a movement against certain environmental measures to it, at least initially, and then they broadened out. I think that's just really interesting that we've gone through this entire political cycle from 2000, when the left was protesting against globalization, to 2021. In the meantime, the consensus around globalization has broken down. The left hasn't been the beneficiaries. And you still don't hear really what I would consider proper anti-globalization arguments on the environmental left so much, right? So degrowth is very abstract, right, as a concept. But if you were to make that concrete, right, if you were to make a concrete kind of program of environmental economics, what would it look like? I think one of the first things it would look like would be renationalization of supply chains, local supply chains, local productive capacity, state investment for local production, whether that be like industrial or it be agricultural or whatever. Like those would be the obvious things that you would call for, but you don't so much hear that. You do sometimes, that you get that from wonks and stuff, right? But you don't see it as a major demand on the streets to say global like supply chains of the type that we have right now. It's not a very good slogan, I don't mean that, right? But global supply chains of the type we have now, they are unstable, they're fragile. We've seen that in recent years. They don't produce good jobs or good pay, right? They create very exploitative conditions, and they're not sustainable.
I think part of the problem here is the way that the left lost the argument about globalization, and what's happened to the organized left since then is that when you put forward anti-globalization arguments, there is a tendency for, you know, people to say that you sound like, you know, you sound alt-right,
Yeah,
when
yeah.
you put forward these arguments about like state control or
Which is strange because they're just the basic social democratic arguments and
absolutely,
ideas. Yeah.
absolutely, and like they're also popular. Do you know what I mean? They're popular ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you can, like we were talking earlier on tonight about the polling data that's just come out from Jacobin that they've done with YouGov,
Mm-hmm.
and it shows how basically it shows the working class voting preference is for what they call populist progressives, which really shouldn't be a surprise to many folk, but the kind of identitarian progressives and identitarian moderates don't fare very well at all.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think like those sorts of solutions about like state control over key industries, renationalizing supply chains, job creation, like that has to form part of like a populist progressive manifesto.
Obviously.
And the working class have to be encouraged to pursue it with self-interest. Do you know what I mean? Like these are things that people would vote for because it's in their interest.
In their direct interest,
to do so.
And in a sense, like we're once again in one of these situations where in some ways we're very lucky, right? That a global crisis for international supply lines has coincided with a widespread discussion about environmental destruction as one product of that system. And that dovetails perfectly with what socialists typically demand in terms of skilled, better paid jobs, more local autonomy, more local democracy, like industries to be based here where we live, that we can control and so on. So like the argument's sitting right there, waiting for someone to take it up. But it doesn't look like at the moment it's the left that is taking that up, and it seems like a very kind of wasted opportunity.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I also, one of the things that is very much like that turn of the century, as you put it, like anti-globalization movement or make poverty history, basically the Bonoization of protest movements that is definitely apparent in COP26 is all the weird theater around it. Like I've seen some videos of like protest performance which chill me to my core.
There's a lot of that. There's a lot of people dressed up as bumblebees and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there was one video I saw which was a procession of women dressed in like what can only be described as sacks. They're dressed in like Hessian sacks.
Yeah.
And with some like hats and some colored, I don't know, accessories or whatever. And they were like in a procession and they were chanting about a grief for a felled tree.
Oh yeah,
You
sent me this. Yeah.
Like what I want in that moment is like I want to know where are the Neds? Where is the intervention? Do you know what I mean? Like,
where are these people that Susan Aiken says are running around trashing the city?
Yeah. I want them to be intervening on that.
No, I did see that. Do you know, like around the whole XR thing, right? There's a lot of that kind of pantomime and all that kind of thesp stuff going on. Some of which I have to say, right, I do think looks quite cool, right? So do you know the people, they look like they've just stepped off of like the stage of Macbeth.
No, see if this is the red cloak people. No, I hate that shit, man.
I think it looks stark.
I think it's naff.
As a protest tactic, I think it's naff. I think it looks cool in general. I also, because you were saying about that poster that has the skeleton on it holding the egg timer thing, right? And it says whatever that horrible slogan is.
Act now before it's too late. He's not holding an egg timer.
What's he doing?
The skeleton, I think, is sitting on an egg timer. The skeleton is holding an Escher puzzle, like an unsolvable square puzzle.
That's even more hopeless.
It's more brutal, isn't it? Because I checked it out the other day. I'm gonna.
I do think it looks cool though. It reminds me of. Do you know the well, people say it's the first trade union. I don't know that it is in Britain. It's the Tolpuddle Martyrs.
Yeah.
I always like loved their banner, and it's really mysterious. It's like it was so their trade union was like a cult. A lot of early trade unions were like that, you know, guilds that were like that. And they met in a loft, I think. And this is like they were like rural laborers. And it was a big banner with it just had a skeleton on it, and it says "Know thine end" on the top of it. And I suppose the message was like, you'd better fight for yourself, because, you know, it's part of like English working class consciousness emerged with, not with atheism, but what did they call it? It's like a version of Christianity where it's very close to atheism. Basically, it doesn't believe that there's a monotheistic God who's like a person. It's just like, it's almost like you worship the universe or something. Anyway, the message of this banner is like, you're gonna have to fight for yourself because you're gonna be dead soon, right? But there's an urgency there. It's like make the most of your life type thing. So I think it looks cool. But what I would say is, do you know, whenever I see that stuff, I think to myself, because I've heard people say, oh, it attracts people to the protest, it makes more people watch what we're doing and stuff like that. And it's like, gets people want to be kind of like more involved in it. No way is that true. I actually watched, there was a guy from the Joe platform, you know, they do like sport and news.
Oh,
and
yeah.
And he went around interviewing people in Glasgow, and everyone's just like, it looks fucking nuts.
Really?
Yeah.
I haven't seen that.
Like, they were just saying, what is this even about? It looks completely crazy. But the people who were actually on the protest were having a whale of a time, because they're all kind of thesp types.
Yeah.
The people who are dressed up as bumblebees and stuff. So it did make me wonder who it's really for.
Well, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, I probably do sound like a real grumpy old killjoy for this stuff. I don't think that like dressing up in rags and crying for trees that have been chopped down is necessarily going to win people to your cause.
Certainly not. And do you know, there's this kind of like Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones kind of like, they love to have this weird liturgy. Like in that video we're watching where they're carrying along that dead tree, they're also talking all kinds of mad shit about open the gates to your city and all this kind of stuff. They're so invested in this kind of like folkloric, do you know what I mean? Like invented sort of, you know, this kind of like they're always trying to like develop these mythologies. And there's a big, you know, LARP kind of element to all this. I mean, it's a bit Dungeons and Dragons. Yeah.
Of course, a recent article in Jacobin about Dungeons and Dragons.
Do you know what I was going to say about that? I was going to tweet about that until I thought better of it. Was do you remember there was a big controversy about 2 years ago when Jacobin published an obituary to Alexander Limonov, who was like a Russian Nazbol, a Russian like national Bolshevik. No, I know. Jacobin published, it might still be up. They published an obituary to Alexander Limonov, who was a Russian nationalist. I mean, I think the argument in the obituary was kind of like, he wasn't really a Nazi. He was just pretentious. These are the people who have like...
That's what they say about you, David.
Their flag was like a red flag with a white circle and a black hammer and sickle, right? So like, I think he was an artist and stuff, and these people, they were crazy, like they were all on drugs and in orgies and shit, right? But they were just...
that's what people say about you.
But yeah, anyway, they published this obituary, and I think the argument in the obituary was sort of like, oh, this is just what, you know, people offering resistance to the decline of like Russian capitalism after the fall of the Soviet Union. This is just one of the mad things that it threw up, and we should see it for what it was, and etc. Anyway, it's not the kind of article you would have thought Jacobin would have published. But I was considering saying when I saw the Dungeons and Dragons article, you know, I defended Jacobin over the Alexander Limonov, but this is too far. This is too reactionary. Like, no, Dungeons and Dragons, it's a nightmare. Actually, I was talking to you about this because a former colleague of mine posted something on social media from some kind of like TV channel that she watches, right?
It's just people playing it.
And it's just people playing Dungeons and Dragons. And they're not like total freaks. I mean, they kind of are. They're adults playing Dungeons and Dragons, but it was like they were like quite kind of sexy TV people, right? And like attractive women and guys and stuff, and they're all sitting. I mean, they're getting paid to do it, obviously, right? But they seemed into it genuinely, playing Dungeons and Dragons. And I was just, I can't believe people are watching this. But the Twitter account for this channel had like 1 million followers.
I mean, I know people who play Dungeons and Dragons. It just does genuinely, without, bringing in my tendency to be culturally snobby. It just doesn't appeal to me at all. I don't like, it doesn't have the aggressive competitive element that I thrive in when it comes to board games. I like Monopoly. Like, I fucking hate all these like have you seen this left-wing Monopoly that Jacobin's brought out? The failing Jacobin. They brought out a left-wing version of Monopoly. No, Monopoly is supposed to be shitty and hard. Yeah. The only way you can win is like fucking everyone over. That's what's enjoyable about it.
They should have brought out a Donald Trump version of Monopoly. But that is the idea, right? Like, you want to be the scumbag on top of the hill at the end.
Top tip for winning at Monopoly is, and I mean this genuinely, like, I'm not doing a bit, is that you always volunteer to go the banker, and then you just steal money out the tray. I think that's actually the only way to win.
Yeah,
is that you just keep stealing like 500s.
So yeah, I don't understand. I don't think I've played a board game in 20 years.
It makes, I do really like playing. I like parlor games. Like, I like dominoes. That sort of thing.
There's a certain quiet dignity to dominoes that doesn't come along with you being in Dungeons and Dragons and deciding you're a dragon or a wizard or something and having to role play your way through all these bizarre scenarios that you come up with.
Yeah, but like, I know people who seem to get a lot of enjoyment out of it, but it's never appealed to me.
Yeah, but in any case, that is now a huge industry, which is, I think, is what this kind of Jacobin article was about how capitalism takes everything, any kind of like pure, untouched human joy, and commodifies it into something shit, right? But I don't know, man. I think Dungeons and Dragons is pretty sinister from the start.
On the topic of, I don't know, surreal performer of role play, can we please talk about Little Amal?
Have you been following her sinister progress around the world? Because she just hasn't turned up in Glasgow.
No, I know. Right. But I only became aware of it for listeners who might not be aware of Little Amal. Little Amal is an 11.5-foot animatronic puppet, which is supposed to represent a girl refugee from Syria. It has been going through towns and villages across Europe and replicating the trek, and has now arrived in Glasgow.
Yeah, that's right. And I suppose it's supposed to be drawing attention to the plight of refugees in Europe. However, she's absolutely terrifying.
I'm gonna, like, the Wikipedia entry for Little Amal brought me quite a lot of joy last night, right? So it was obviously started by like a puppet company.
Yeah.
It's got this excellent line, right? It says the puppet was carried during 5 months from the Syria-Turkey border via Europe to the United Kingdom, and walked and took part in locally arranged events in 65 towns and cities along the way. Little Amal was greeted at some venues by local dignitaries such as Pope Francis and Caroline McIntosh, Mayor of Barnsley.
I like that. I did see her with wee Frankie, as I call Pope Francis, as his close friends.
Yeah.
Call him.
Yeah. I really like the idea of the Pope being a local dignitary.
Yeah.
It's very Alan Partridge.
Yeah, no, it is. That's a
Yeah.
good wee script there. But no, she has this kind of like kind of shiny dead face, and it's quite terrifying. I dare say it's even more terrifying if she's looming over you trying to shake your hand.
As she was on Gender Day.
Was she?
Yeah,
Oh,
when she made her appearance at Gender
I've seen
Day.
this, and she's looming there.
And she's looming there, like behind the speaker, like, and then she gives the speaker a hug. So it's this like huge monster, like coming down to like hug this woman.
Terrifying.
Right? But this is the thing, right? On a serious point, is that she's appearing, you know, to represent the journey of the refugee and all this stuff, right? Which, you know, I'm sure the motives behind it are good. But what's happened is that it's become completely fucking depoliticized. So she's appearing at an event with people like Nancy Pelosi, who were all in favor of interventions within the Middle East that led to some of the disruption in Syria. In fact, like Pelosi, Barack Obama, who's been swanning around the United Nations, backed the Timber Sycamore project, which was a CIA project to back Syrian fighters. And inevitably, the CIA armed
Islamic State and al-Nusra and stuff.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, Barack Obama signed that deal. He signed that deal. And then, do you know what I mean? They're all like celebrating little Amal.
Yeah. And by the way, this happens just as the refugee crisis is ticking up again. So right now, as we speak, on the border of Poland and Belarus, there's a standoff between thousands of refugees, mostly from the Middle East, and Polish police, and almost certainly as well, because this is what happened during the last refugee crisis. Like paramilitaries, like far-right paramilitaries, right, who stalk the forests of these border areas, trying to stop refugees entering into the free movement zone. Right, this is European.
I've seen those pictures.
European free movement is a color line, and you're free to move if you're a white European, and if you are a Middle Easterner or suspected of being such, not so much. So they are there on the border of Europe now. So yeah, no, it's the same situation. I dare say little Amal is not. So Angela Merkel and Joe Biden are saying that these refugees are only there because it's all Putin's conspiracy. Once again, right? Putin. They're calling it politically organized migration or something. So they're funneling these migrants into the EU to attack the West, right? Such a dangerous thing to be saying, by the way. By the way, to portray refugees from the Middle East fleeing into Europe as an attack on the West is itself, like, I mean, vicious sloganizing, right? And, you know, it's like, it's not like a fucking trust Putin or Lukashenko not to be looking out for their own interests in all this. But it's just it's also another ludicrous conspiracy theory getting churned out by people like Biden and Merkel. Merkel, let's not forget, by the way, said Greta Thunberg was a Russian agent.
Did she?
Merkel blamed the Fridays for Future in Germany on Putin.
Did she?
People forget.
Not know that. I did not.
People forget. Excellent. People forget how much has been blamed on Russia, including stuff like this, which is just totally vanilla. I mean, well, you could do a great little graphic of that, by the way, of like Greta emerging as the final Russian doll out of Putin.
Nice. You could get a job doing the front page of the Spectator.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing they'd do. So the refugee crisis is on as we speak, and I dare say, if she gets near them, little Amal will be hugging Merkel and Joe Biden.
Well, I mean, totally. This is what happens when you make all politics about, like, you know, moralism, is that you depoliticize the question of like movement of people. And I don't doubt that, no, I know that part of the conflict in Syria was exacerbated by climate change. But to then like completely ignore the role that
imperial intervention,
that like, well, Obama's government and and his supporters and the Democrats, like their role in backing those CIA programs is just fucking disingenuous.
Yeah, totally.
At best.
Yeah.
At best.
Though, I mean, like, I dare say the people who are puppeteering for Little Amal will say, and you know what, from their point of view, maybe they have a point. All they care about at this point is creating a kind of mood of sympathy in the public for refugees, given that there's probably going to be another refugee crisis. Fair enough, but the rest of us have to maintain a degree of cynicism, frankly, about that situation.
Like, the thing is, like, you have to, in order to properly have solidarity with refugees, I think there has to be a degree of like understanding why people are leaving, right? And that can't be done through moral blackmail, like simply by using like a child, the same way that you can't like galvanize like the majority of people in the country, like the working class. You can't get them behind climate demands simply by saying, won't someone think of the children?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? We have to be saying, no, won't someone think of like who's the least attractive figure that we can think of in this situation? Like, so what, like, say a Syrian man trying to, like, we have to like have as much solidarity with a Syrian man who's trying to enter the West.
Do you remember that was a whole bit of it? As I was a wee girl, do you remember people kept saying, if these refugees are so desperate, how comes I don't see any families here? How comes it's all young men? Yeah. So exactly. It doesn't really help.
Do you know what I mean? It's a Bonoization again. This is all like it's the same trend. Do you know what I mean? The same way that like there's loads of like stuff around Glasgow, which is like very won't someone think of the children about climate crisis? And yeah, it's young people that have a big price to pay. But we also do have to address the questions like, well, how do you have like any type of just transition? Like what happens to oil workers?
Yeah.
During what happens to Grangemouth? What happens to these places where people work in fairly highly paid jobs at the moment? How do you switch them over? Like, and
yeah,
like
it's not as kind of appealing.
It's not as moralistically appealing. It's much more complicated. It's kind of more of a grey, like.
It's like, okay, so during the Fridays for Future protest that I said was giving me huge like recall, by the way, some of which, by the way, I can't blame on anyone but myself. There was a huge like wacky Trotskyist contingent who wouldn't speak to me, right? And do you know what I mean? There were some odd scruffy looking young guys selling newspapers now. That's my own fault that I've got flashback, you know what I mean, like Vietnam style for that.
Yeah, I wish those sorts of Trotskyist groups had their own giant puppets
of like Trotsky or something.
Yeah,
that'd be cool. I want to shake giant Trotsky's hands.
Not Trotsky, but it would be like, you know, like their leaders.
Oh yeah, their particular sect leaders.
Have like a 11.5-foot animatronic Peter Taft battling an 11.5-foot animatronic. What's your one, Tony Cliff?
Anyone normal listening to this, we've just lost.
I know.
This is worse than Dungeons and Dragons.
But see, well, actually,
Trotsky and Dragons.
Let's be honest, right?
Yeah.
The reason that neither of us play Dungeons and Dragons,
we've done our own version.
We've both been in Trotskyist organizations.
Yeah,
it's the left. I mean, that's our own thing. We became
more shameful.
The dungeon master of our own sect.
Sounds genuinely sinister. No, yeah. That would have been interesting and haunting. But anyway, but when I was down at that, God, the horror of that idea has shocked out of me what I was going to say.
Sorry, they wouldn't speak to you, these Trotskyist groups, and it brought back all your bad memories.
Yeah, but there was something else. Crap, I can't remember it. No, I've lost it.
You did tell me that you encountered lots of mad religious people as well.
Yeah, no, I speaking of the Pope, there was a really interesting like Calvinist cult there. Um, do you know, I was thinking about that though. Like, no one would object to me calling them a cult, but honestly, there was other stuff going on down there. Trotskyism and some forms of environmentalism, which could easily just as well fill that kind of that description. But they seem to have come from mostly London, from their accents, as far as I could tell. And they were handing out free books, not just free pamphlets. I got a few free books about the Pope and how the Pope was behind COP26, Pope 26.
I
And
feel like I want to do like a Pope puppet wordplay.
yeah,
Pope it? No, it doesn't really work.
So
you
but
got your free books.
I got my free books, and they explained some stuff to me about how the Pope was behind COP26. Apparently, I didn't know this, but the event in Scotland is co-hosted by Italy. So there you go.
I did not know this. That's evidence enough.
To get that kind of information, you need to go to the Calvinists. And they were saying this is because ultimately, yeah, the Pope's behind it, and behind the Pope. Well, the Pope is the Antichrist, but behind the Antichrist, the devil, presumably. And yeah, it's all part of the devil's plan to bring about one world government, etc., etc. Which is as plausible as many other things that I've heard about COP26 in the last few weeks. So yeah, no, but you know, they were quite charming. The thing about religious cults is it's not going to be like the Trotskyists didn't want to speak to me, which is not good proselytism, by the way, right? You should have been ramming your propaganda down my throat. The religious, on the other hand, were perfectly happy to speak to me, and they were more than prepared to give me free literature, all of which is absolutely fascinating. So my what I would say to today's Trotskyists is you should learn from the most dedicated religious cultists. The some of the vegans, right? So they had kind of placards that said things like we need a plant-based recovery for the planet, and you know, meat equals heat. You know, not the most inventive, but it does rhyme. They weren't as appealing, but they were very friendly. They were handing out free lentils.
I mean, that's just charming.
It's a cliche, but it wasn't one I was complaining about because it's free food, you know.
Like, was it just lentils, or was it like flavored?
Oh yeah, it was lentil gloop.
Oh, le gloop.
Le gloop, but I actually did turn it down in the end out of sanitary concerns.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Because as you know, I'm a bit of a kind of germaphobe. But and I, this is wrong, but this is terrible, right? But whenever I took literature from a Trotskyist, an environmentalist, or a Calvinist, I instantly used my antibacterial gel. And that's not a thing I do with like in my day-to-day life. I don't want people to think every time I handle cash or something, I'm like, oh, people have touched this, right? It's those three particular groups.
Yeah.
There was something that made me feel there might be a slight uncleanliness.
The religious, the hippies, and the trots.
Yeah, three groups of people who, from personal experience, which could be wrong, aren't terribly hygienic.
Sometimes when you get the Venn diagram crossover, like where you get like the religious hippies, like they get really crusty.
Yeah.
And like
I mean, like kind of like Quakers.
Like
I shouldn't say that.
Get like Christian anarchists.
Oh yeah,
those types of people. They're all like...
Someone who describes themselves as a Christian anarchist is very likely to offer you homemade hummus, but you'd be worried about consuming that as well.
Yeah, or a suspect falafel.
Yeah,
I like the Quakers.
I like the Quakers. No, Quakers don't belong in there. Quakers are much more respectable than that.
Yeah,
and they do things like they like homemade bacon.
I think like most of the mainstream religions are fine. Like I wouldn't feel the need for like hand sanitizing. But like when it starts getting a bit fringe. Yeah,
when the people start being a bit wild-eyed.
Yeah.
Do you know though, like I'm slagging these people off. There was a part of me, honestly, when I was there talking to these members of this cult, and when I say a cult, I mean it was really, really out there, right? But part of me did think, like, I thought I was walking away from the protest and I thought maybe I should ask one of these guys if they want to go up and see the statue of John Knox. It's just down the road from there, right? And we could chat about John Knox. And then I thought, I bet they wouldn't let that happen. Because it was, so when I say cult, it was one of those ones where they won't let them fraternize with people outside, right? Because that's how people get deprogrammed, is just contact with other people. But I did think it did make me a bit like genuinely sad, because what sorts of people join a cult like that? It's people who they need that overwhelming sense of authority in their lives. And you know what I mean? Because they've been destabilized in their lives in some ways, overwhelmingly. That's the sorts of people who become addicted to the cult life.
I mean, I can absolutely see the appeal.
Yeah.
Like, I do like the idea of like some degree of submission, for want of a better word, to like a higher authority.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Like, I absolutely see the appeal in that.
It emotionally simplifies your life a lot.
Oh, completely.
And it, you know, there's always an authority you can go to answer your questions. And you know, like, people sometimes go too far when they describe like small left-wing sects as being like cults. Like, every form of human social relationship, I think, is on a cultic spectrum, right? I mean, it's the same ingredients in a cult, by the way, that you get in a family unit or a group of friends, just intensified, right? And quite formally kind of organized. But, you know, a small left-wing sect like that provides its members with the same thing, like an ultimate source of authority, a body of works that you can go to and read and study and reproduce, that solves all the difficult and anxiety-causing problems in a wider view of the world. I mean, there's a certain logic there. Like,
I think the one thing that like distinguishes the cult like from those other types of situations, so like whether that is being in like a left-wing organization or a family or friendship group, is to do with the consequences when you leave.
Yeah.
Like that's the game changer, is that if you step away from the herd, that you are then shunned, that you're then outcast. Like, and that does happen in some political organizations.
Only in the very crazy end.
Yeah, on the fringes, but it does happen.
Yeah.
But that doesn't tend to happen in other social circumstances.
That's true. It did used to happen, of course, in the Catholic Church. I mean, excommunication. I know people who were kicked out, and when you say excommunication, you always think it's for like some kind of
grand heresy.
Yeah. You always think it's like what were some of the heresies, like Arianism and stuff like that, and Gnosticism. But no, I mean, I think like, you know, I mean, in the 50s, women used to get kicked out of the church because they cheated on their husbands and stuff like that, right? So there used to be a lot more of that, but I suppose, I don't know. I mean, you know, this is like a famously vexed question among academics who study cults. It's almost impossible to define, because almost any list of attributes would also apply to a major world religion. So yeah, no, it's but I wouldn't, you know, shake hands with a Buddhist and then feel the desperate need to wash my hands. Though one thing that did occur to me on the march was I actually felt quite safe from COVID, despite it being very packed. Because
why is that?
Well, I just sort of thought these people have a strong natural immunity.
It's all the lentils.
Yeah, but I was also thinking about your sort of low hygiene. Yeah, but turmeric, if people don't know and are listening to this, it's a natural cure for COVID-19. I have to stress, it's not a natural cure for COVID-19, because if I say that on here, we'll probably end up getting like banned from YouTube or something.
Yeah, probably. Anyway, right.
Take Bill Gates's vaccine.
I think that maybe this is me just dipping my toe into this conversation at the moment. But I think that we do have to talk about the class composition of those marches on Friday and Saturday. Like, I think that those marches were predominantly middle class. I think that's fair to say that.
Mm-hmm. And that's not uncommon.
And it's also not. It's also like not a criticism or a judgment. I just think that has to be said.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Of course, and and not entirely. It needs to be said as well. But we're talking in generalities, and of course, I mean, both the protests I were on, they didn't even just. I mean, to say middle class is kind of to miss the point almost, because it's not even. It's more subcultural than that. It's very particular parts of the middle class.
Yeah.
It's like I said though, like I could really identify. Do you know what I got again as well? We've talked about it a few times now, right? But the opening, 20 or 30 pages of that book, The End of History, where it describes a certain type of like Western sort of lower middle class, I don't know what you would call it, person, right? And just reading and their culture and their cultural expectations and their cultural experience, and reading that, and again getting that very kind of creepy kind of deja vu feeling, right? One of the things that demonstration did to me, it was a bit of an ego shrinker, because I remember being on that demo and thinking, as you get older, you realize how much of a cliche you are. And when you're younger, you tend to think like there's something special about you or something like that. So it was another one of those kind of nodal points where I was like, Christ, there really is a whole layer of people in society who are just like me, who have very similar cultural experiences, who come from very similar parts of the general population, many of whom are probably narcissistic and egotistic in the same way. Like at this point, I'm looking around at all these kind of like 17-year-olds, and a lot of them probably think they are special in the way that 17-year-old me did. And it is just terrifying again when you realize, no, you really are part of a much more general and widespread force of social reproduction.
See, I think that's the difference, is I don't find it terrifying.
I say terrifying. You know what I mean? I find it disconcerting slightly. Humbling, and that can be a good way as well as a challenging kind of way. But like it can make you laugh at yourself a bit more.
Well, yeah,
there's a total absurdity to the situation.
I think that has to be the key to the secret of life, is just don't take yourself too seriously.
Because there were so many people, honestly, I could have pointed them and said, there were young guys on that march who I could have walked up to and said, "You're me." Right? There's a serious danger that in 15 years' time, you're going to be making a podcast, making these same reflections, right? Especially the ones carrying newspapers. But no. Look, it was very much made up of. It was very recognizably the middle class left and all its various tribes and subsections.
There are people.
So no, I think that's obviously true. But again, to me, it was the reenactment vibe. People say that there's a special problem in attracting, working class people to that type of politics, and I dare say that's true. But as we were just discussing, it's because it's not linked up in people's minds with concrete proposals for how people actually live and work and interact in contemporary society, which also limits it off from much of the middle class as well, incidentally. But I mean, slogans like degrowth and this apocalyptic thing, as we've discussed, won't do anything, I think, to build that bridge.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that there are genuinely aspects of Extinction Rebellion which are sinister. That, like, there's an article, really good article by Ken Malik.
I have not read this.
In The Observer.
Yeah.
Where he's basically making these points about how pessimism has infected the left. Like the kind of the crisis, like the end is coming, a lot of these points. He references one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion, this guy, is it Roger Hallen? You think his name is?
Yeah, I know him.
You know who that is?
Yeah.
He's done a video which is like advice to young people on the future of the planet. And it's like a 2 hour long YouTube video, right? And it is fucking dark shit. It's like he's painting this picture of the future where he talks about like one day a gang of young men is going to break into your house demanding food. They will take your mother, your girlfriend, your sister. They will gang rape her.
Oh
They will
my
put cigarettes
God.
out in your eyes. That's the consequences of climate change. It's fucking dark, man.
So literally the road.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
That's what, yeah.
Yeah.
And this is, but the video is titled like advice to young people or a message to children and young people about the future. And I'm just like, how the fuck can you say these things?
No, that's wild. He's wild. I've seen him in a few interviews, and he always comes across terribly. The thing is, his whole worldview is totally captured by this sense, right? And you get it from some other people doing some of what I would consider the more inadvisable types of climate protests, right? Like lying in front of roads or climbing on trains. And what they always say is, look, there's an absolute moral imperative here. There's an absolute moral imperative, and that overrides everything. It overrides my safety. It overrides like PR. It overrides popularity. There's an absolute moral imperative to take a stand. And I think a lot of people have decided that, in all seriousness, in 60 or 70 years' time, the only question people will ask about folk in our generation is, what did you do to stop this, right? First of all, as we've already discussed, I don't believe that. I think there's this kind of there's this weird kind of tautological view of history. Do you know what I mean? Where it's like they've already decided the outcome of things and we're working backwards. And I think that's nonsense. But also to have that sense of overriding moral imperative. I used to use that, by the way. I used to, like, when I was first involved in kind of left-wing politics, you know, I used to have that general attitude. I'm so overwhelmingly right about things that no tactic is wrong. Do you know what I mean? That no slogan, no matter how subcultural and off-putting, can be wrong, because I'm overwhelmingly right about things. It's a classic thing that young people think. But a guy, Roger Hallam, who's 65 or something, should not be going around spouting that stuff. And he seems to be getting worse.
Yeah, I mean, this is unhinged.
He actually, I think, left XR in order to set up an even more like extreme group, right, who are involved in even more pointless forms of action.
I didn't even think there were that many actions in Glasgow.
No,
there was that one, like, people blocked the bridge.
Yeah.
But what else was there?
I didn't think there was a great deal. But then it's only kind of a hardcore, perhaps, of activists who can afford to travel to a big road show like this. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Though, I mean, as we were saying, like, the international character of the march was very apparent.
Yeah.
But I mean, to be honest, I didn't see any really bad anti-natalist stuff. Despite the so yeah, no, I think we avoided the worst of that. But yeah, there's still when that, especially when that's the stuff that gets through, because it's the stuff the media wants to highlight.
Of course.
There's a reason why, like, those Insulate Britain actions have been seen by so many people, and why LBC keep pushing them around everywhere, right? And all these kinds of outlets. It's because that's very much what they want the population's view of environmental activism to be. Whereas the vast majority of stuff that's been going on in Glasgow over the last couple of weeks has been, like, somewhat more conventional, I suggest.
Sorry, I got distracted by looking at Twitter.
You're part of this generation of people who can't look away from Twitter for more than about 20 minutes.
I mean, says you.
I know, it's terrible.
Yeah, you love Twitter.
It's awful, isn't it?
You just can't stop yourself doing big threads.
I haven't done a thread in a while, a big thread. My brother pointed out to me recently that I'd done like 30,000 tweets since I set it up about 7 or 8 years ago.
Yeah.
And then I realized I could actually count if I wanted to. Do you know what I mean? I could count how many that was a day and then break it down into how much time I might have spent on it.
How do you find out how many tweets you've done?
See, I'd never looked for
how
it.
many have you done? How many did you say?
I've so about 30,000, I think. How many have you done?
16,000.
So I've done like twice as many as you. But I'd never seen that figure before, right? And it is like being confronted with the most ludicrous. I mean, that is a ludicrous
It's
amount.
like this is your life for our generation.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Instead of getting like the red.
This is your shit life.
This is your life online.
No, it's terrible. That's terrible.
Are we done?
I think so.
Okay. Done.